Yeah,
Life is good. And you know what? I mean, Alberta politics, this is what we're here to talk about. There's no shortage of stuff to write about that's both fascinating and kind of horrifying at the exact same time.
and also hard to keep up with because one thing happens which leads to another thing, and then it's just so observers like us are being kept quite busy these days. I was at a rally earlier today when it was 30 degrees out and not raining, hosted by the Alberta Federation of Labor. It was sort of like a rally and a march gathered, behind the library, which is called Centennial Plaza. I didn't know that. And then, sort of march past the convention center where I believe HSAA is having its convention, healthcare union, not the one you work for, but another one, and to the park that's actually right by where I live.
Was it a good turnout, or?
It was a good turnout. Yeah. There were, I would say there were more than 1,000 people there, but the thing was, and I'm glad it happened. I think we're kind of past the point now of just rallying, I think we're so far down the rabbit hole at this point that I'd like to see more things I probably shouldn't say on a live stream, especially not with Dave Berta. Don't want to get him into trouble. Look on Dave's faces. But no, but it was good turnout. Too many speeches though, I gotta say. Too many speeches. Near the end, Chris Galloway and Bradley LaFortune got up to speak, representing Friends of Medicare and Public Interest Alberta, respectively. I see Brad just entered the chat. And Chris made a comment, and that was like, great to be here. Everyone knows that once, a rally hits its 15th speaker, that's when it really gets going. So, and I thought that was a very lighthearted way to sort of observe. Like there were so many labor leaders, which, good to have this sort of unified display against just everything, right? And I think Gil McGowan did a good job sort of highlighting this when he spoke, saying, well, people are asking, where are we protesting? It's like everything, right? All of it, right? Because and I think the separatist movement really is the culmination of all these other things, like privatized healthcare, like the assault on trans rights, and of course labor rights, the fossil fuel dependence that's only getting deepened. But I think some of the most interesting speeches were by people outside of the labor movement, like Chief Sheldon Sunshine of Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation, who has really, I think, taken on a leadership role in pushing back against separatism. Someone from Migrante spoke, which is very important because, again, we're in addition to the big referendum, we're also having these sort of ancillary referendums on restricting immigrants' access to social services and a bunch of constitutional things that we don't have control over, but provides, grist for the mill. And so, it was good. I'm glad it happened. I guess, anything to, because I think it's really like, for purposes of the media, I think a lot of these sorts of demonstrations are very spectacular in that regard, right? Where it's to just, have sort of these voices of opposition in the conversation and not allowing both, Mitch Sylvester and Daniel Smith, and also, I mean, like guys like Jason Kenney and Corey Hogan, and those figures who are sort of taking up this establishment mantle of
Mhm.
opposing separatism.
Yeah, and
Um,
I think that's a good point, Jeremy. And I think like for a lot of people, a lot of Albertans who aren't wrapped up in the separatism debate, as in like are they or aren't they don't necessarily find themselves people who don't necessarily find themselves in the UCP kind of in the heat of this debate that's like I mean largely taking place inside conservative circles in this province. Obviously, like the separatism debate is like a debate that affects us all, and it's something that we're all going to be involved in, and all we all have an opinion on. But the only area where there's really disagreement in about separatism, elder separatism, is really among conservatives in Alberta. And I mean, if you look at the polling, I think the polling said like 98% of NDP voters in this province support Alberta remaining in Canada. The division really is among UCP voters, right? So it's there's what
yeah,
60% UCP voters want say they'd support Alberta separating, 40% or 35% say they'd support staying. So for Albertans who don't find themselves under that conservative brand, blanket branch tent. Um, but they're frustrated with what the government is doing, frustrated with the policies that the UCP is implementing, frustrated that the government is moving forward with this separation referendum. I think that uh, actions like we saw today. I mean, there was rallies in communities big and small, from Calgary and Edmonton and Grand Prairie and Lethbridge to I think I saw one in Langdon, one in Vermilion. There's definitely provides an outlet for people to do, because I know a lot of progressive type Albertans who I've spoken with have been frustrated that there hasn't really been an outlet for them to express themselves. They can volunteer with the NDP or donate money to the NDP, but until an election actually happens, and I mean, obviously, if you want the government to change, supporting the opposition party is a big important part of that, and putting in the groundwork ahead of time is important. But um, d having actions that you can actually get out and do now is something that I think a lot of people were looking for. And I mean, we'll see what happens after this, and whether whether there's opportunities for people to do things after this, and whether there's some momentum that continues on into the referendum, into the fall, into the next provincial election, and whether that leads to people getting more engaged, people who are at these rallies, for example, today, to get more engaged in groups that are being active in the referendum, like Forever Canadian, like the uh, Lead Not Leave group, like the Vote to Stay group, all these kind of groups that we've seen pop up. I mean, Forever Canadian's been around for a while, but there's all these other groups that we're seeing that are more conservative leaning, that are popping up right now, and we're going to probably see a lot more in the next 4 months as these other groups start to pop up. I did want to just touch on another point you made, Jeremy, about Chief Sheldon Sunshine speaking at the rally, and I think that's something that's really important, and it's got a lot of coverage, but it hasn't really got, I think, the level of recognition that it deserves. Is First Nations chiefs and First Nations leaders have been a probably the most effective bulwark against
mhm.
the groups organizing for separatism, to hold this separation referendum, to organizing separatist efforts, and putting pressure on the Alberta government to hold the separation referendum. And I think that the First Nations chiefs really deserve a lot of recognition for, I mean, not only just taking them on in courts, but getting out there and challenge. I mean, the press conferences that the chiefs have been holding, um, and basically like having no holds barred and saying exactly what they think about what the provincial government is doing, moving towards a separation referendum, and the kind of acquiescing and appeasing that the premier has been doing to the large group of separatists within her own United Conservative Party. So I think that's something that we shouldn't, as we move on in this referendum process over the next 4 months, I think that's something that we really need to keep in mind, and recognize like the power that they have.
Yeah. And also I think drawing a connection between the separatist movement and the um sort of Smith and Carney's, by the way, reorienting the state to like serve the interests of like fossil fuel capital, right? Like I mean really the only people in the mainstream who are drawing that connection that I can think of are, the chiefs of Treaty First Nations, because they've had to deal with the consequences of, industry, for a very, very long time. Right.
Mm.
And, yeah, and I mean the NDP. There were a bunch of MLAs. Nenshi, nowhere to be seen. Maybe he was in Calgary. I mean, his riding is attached to the riding in which the rally took place. So his absence was quite conspicuous. But Raki Pancholi was one of the speakers, of course, the deputy leader. Janice Irwin was there, of course, Brooks Arcane Paul, Joe Calhoun Stonehouse, David Egan, Sharif Haji, David Shepard,
Mhm.
and probably others who I didn't recognize because I haven't met them before. So in that, I was wondering if they were going to have someone from the NDP speak, because I know that there's always a sense that you don't want this to be a partisan thing, right?
Mhm.
But the problem with that is it is a partisan thing. It's been made a partisan thing. So I don't know, might as well embrace it. I mean, you've got the New Democrats coming out solidly against independence. Lots of critiques to be made about the way they've done so and how they've handled it. But I mean, at the end of the day, if we want to stop this, it's going to need to be a broad coalition, right?
Well, and it's hard
And
to. I mean, we do. I mean, I know there are folks who are subscribers on Alberta, who are supporters of the Alberta Party and supporters of the new Progressive Tory Party. But so far, it doesn't look like that party has had any traction, really. So we're talking about, this is really a two-party political ecosystem that we live in, right? I mean, the latest poll that just came out from Angus Reid the other day had the UCP at 46%, the NDP at 45%, which was quite a surprising turn, and I think probably has a lot to do with Albertans' reaction to the separation referendum. Now, whether that sticks or not, I mean, those are pretty darn good numbers for the NDP. It might be their highest numbers since the last provincial election. Um, but whether that sticks or not is another question. But it definitely, I think, is probably symbolic of Albertans' reaction to the separation referendum. Not necessarily, but not to dig my NDP friends, but not necessarily the work that the NDP has done, but more of a reaction against the government. But that's how politics works, and that's how
yeah,
politics works.
well, I mean, the NDP could be doing a lot more, for sure, to challenge this agenda. Which, again, separatism is a manifestation of it. It's not the and I guess it's a useful signpost for sort of bringing all of these issues together. But you know, and I thought Raki's speech was actually very good,
Mhm.
and she made one remark that I thought was very instructive about how the NDP is the party that cut child poverty in half when it was in power, and I was like, I haven't heard Rachel Notley say that, let alone Nenshi. But yeah, I mean, the Progressive Tory Party, the only people I ever hear talk about them are NDP people who are trying to
Mhm.
convince like their conservative relatives not to vote for the UCP, which I don't think bodes well for Peter Guthrie and his party. But maybe let's talk about this referendum, right? Because I think a lot of people, the conventional wisdom was we were going to get the Stay Free Alberta question, and then it got stymied in court
Mhm.
thanks to the interventions of Athabasca Chippewa First Nation and the Blackfoot Confederacy and Sturgeon Lake, although their line of arguing didn't convince the judge. They were certainly part of that. And so everyone was like, Lukasik petition, I actually in the book I wrote on Daniel Smith that's coming out in October, I don't even mention the Lukasik petition, the Forever
Mhm.
Canada thing. And I was like, am I going to have to add it? Of course, they had that committee hearing. Thank you to everyone who tuned into it with me, even though I couldn't get the sound to stream from it. Um, but including you, I believe, Dave. But yeah, I was like, okay, so that they're just going to do that. That's going to be their path to a referendum. It will be asked, do you want to stay in Canada? And then Smith comes out with this referendum on whether to have a referendum, well, whether to initiate the process required
Mhm.
under the Canadian Constitution to have an independence referendum. And I think people are still calling it an independence referendum by short, because I mean that is the substance of the question. It's just, you know, um kicking the can down the road while the Alberta government joined Stay Free Alberta in challenging the separatist petition
Mhm.
in court. Um, Now, the separatists, like Mitch Sylvester, Jeffrey Rath, sort of the two biggest names, I would say, in the separatist movement. I mean, Dennis Modry as well, but he's been kind of low profile lately.
Mhm.
Um, they're pretty mad, I would say. I would say they're furious.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, I expected Rath to come out because that is sort of his style, right? He's a bit of a flamethrower. Uh, but I thought Sylvester, because he's a UCP Constituency Association president. I think he's more of a savvier political actor than someone like Jeffrey Rath or David Parker. Dare I say? But Jason Markustoff had that piece the other day where he's like, yeah, I think we might be trying to get a leadership review or to change the question or get the UCP declared an official separatist party. And I'm wondering, Dave, because that does seem very counterproductive to me, especially getting rid of Smith,
Mhm.
because she is moving the ball in their direction. And I think if she was able to, she would give them their referendum question. But were you surprised by this reaction from separatist leaders for this referendum question that isn't exactly what they wanted, but is a step in that direction?
I mean, I guess no, I wasn't too surprised. I mean, going back to your one thing you mentioned earlier about the kind of the Franken question that we're going to be faced with in October, and that's a description that University of Calgary prof Lisa Young coined on her Substack that I thought was quite good.
I'm
Um,
calling it referendumception, but
referendumception. There you go.
Lisa seems to be sticking more. So
I think that I think it's telling, and I mean it's deeply cynical that I mean, it just shows you how deeply cynical this whole process has been. That the UCP government was totally willing to let the Forever Canadian question and Forever Canadian petition that was signed. I mean, a petition that was signed by about 450,000 Albertans, which is a lot of people, more than the separatist Stay Free Alberta group claims signed their own petition. The government was willing to let it die at committee up until the moment that the judge, Justice Leonard, ruled against the separatist petition and ruled against and quashed Elections Alberta's approval of the separatist question. And then, almost immediately, the UCP called this committee, this special select committee on the citizen initiatives that, from what I understand, wasn't supposed to meet again until the fall, and was basically going to run the clock out on the Forever Canadian petition question. And all of a sudden they turn around and they're deeply interested in this question. There was the whole chaos of the meeting, which was chaired by Leduc Beaumont, UCP MLA Brendan Lenty, when the UCP caucus sent out a press release announcing that the question had passed committee. The press release was sent out just as MLAs were beginning to debate the motion at committee. It was chaotic. They ran the clock, had to come back the next day, and then approve the question. And then it turns out that the Forever Canadian question isn't really the one that's on the ballot. It's part of the Forever Canadian question is on the ballot, or the Forever Canadian question is part of the question on the ballot, but instead it's this kind of mixed question between, do you want Alberta to remain in Canada, or do you want to have a referendum at some point in the future to start negotiations to leave Canada? So it's not really what the 450,000 people who signed the Forever Canadian petition wanted. And truthfully, I mean, most of the people who signed the Forever Canadian petition, and including myself who signed it, I mean, I signed it with the assumption that that it would basically block a separatist referendum, that the government would never adopt it. And then the separatists from the Stay Free Alberta group saw the referendum question that Danielle Smith proposed, and they're not happy about it either because it doesn't actually include the question that they wanted, that their 300,000 petitioners signed, or petition signatures.
Allegedly
Well,
signed. We don't know. Yeah.
allegedly, yeah, and quite. I mean, whether it was 300,000, I think they probably got a lot of signatures because
Oh yeah, they got. I'm
the kind
sure
of
they got at least 178,000.
this
Like
is a group that has been out
there are a
organizing
lot
for a
of
long time, and they do have support. So, I
there's
mean,
sucker
300,000
born
is a
every
lot.
minute, right?
Well, yeah, and there's yeah, um, but so no one's really happy with this. The people who didn't want, or people who want to remain in Canada, who didn't want to who signed the Forever Canadian petition to block a referendum with the intention of blocking a referendum because no one ever thought the UCP would put the Forever Canadian question to the ballot. They're unhappy, and the people who signed or supported the Stay Free Alberta petition for the most part, and there's some split in that group, but for the most part, I think they're probably unhappy because it's not the clear question that they wanted. And I guess the question is who has this made who does Danielle Smith's referendum question make happy? And I'm not sure it even makes Danielle Smith happy, or does it make her leadership even any smoother over the next 4 months. So I'm not totally surprised to see folks like Mitch Sylvestre, I should say, from Bonnyville, who to talk about collecting the signatures of 21 or 22 UCP constituency association presidents that are needed to trigger a special general meeting to call for a leadership race, which is kind of the same thing that they did to Jason Kenney back 4 years ago. I'm not surprised to see him doing this because the United Conservative Party base and their activist base, it's a very unruly group, and I mean unruly in the way of it's not a centrally controlled group. This isn't a top-down political party in the same way that a lot of traditional political parties are. This is a party that is very decentralized in its power structure, where the constituency associations have a lot of freedom, have a lot of money, and have the ability to to pull a leader down through through this process. And I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if they would be able to get the 21 or 22 constituency association presidents to sign this out of 87 ridings. I mean, these are groups like Take Back Alberta, like the Alberta Prosperity Project, who have been very active in taking over and electing their people to be constituency presidents and constituency directors across the province for years. They now they control the UCP provincial board. I mean, I've seen a lot of media coverage over the past few weeks, a lot of it from national media who's talking about, oh, the separatists are going to take over the United Conservative Party. Well, that ship has sailed. There's, the
Yeah.
separatists and the kind of populist groups that came out of the COVID-19 pandemic. They control the United Conservative Party. They are the most enthusiastic, energetic activists in the party. They're the ones who show up to the AGMs locally. They're the ones who show up to the provincial AGM. They're the ones who booed Danielle Smith when Jeffrey Rath challenged her during the last AGM about the pipeline MOU with Mark Carney.
Oh, well, I rewatched that and it was interesting. I was at the convention on the second day. I wasn't there the first night, but I rewatched it recently when I was working on the book, and
Yeah,
and you noticed, and I talked to some people too who also like confirm like. She gets booed when she mentions the MOU and how Canada can work.
yeah,
Then she goes on to list all the concessions Carney made,
yeah,
and she gets cheers, right?
yeah.
And I was talking with a couple separatists at the convention, and they were like, "Yeah, we weren't booing her, we were
Mhm.
booing Carney."
Yeah,
Right? And Janet Brown, I was talking to her, and that was her sense as well, that
yeah,
it was they were brewing the idea of like working together with the Canadian government, but not Smith,
yeah,
and certainly not what they got out of the Canadian government, which is just a whole lot of concessions on very important existential issues for the future of the planet, for nothing, almost
yeah.
nothing.
Well, and I think this is the challenge for Danielle Smith is, and I mean, I've heard Janet. You mentioned Janet Brown. I've heard Janet talk about this before. I was on a podcast with her on the line, I think late last fall, or earlier this year, where we talked about this, about the kind of the three groups in Alberta politics that, that when you're talking about this, the people's opinions on sovereignty and separation, Janet kind of divided them neatly or crudely into three categories. And obviously there's some flex on this back and forth. But you have about a third to a half of people who support Albertans who support remaining in Canada. You have about a third, who aren't happy with the current situation in, the Alberta's current relationship with Ottawa, but they don't want to separate from Canada. And then you have this, 25% to a third group who want to separate from Canada. And that's all, depending on the question you ask and how they get pressed on the question, these numbers can move around. But I mean, this is the challenge for Danielle Smith, is the balancing between those two groups, is the separatists in her party and the Conservatives who are unhappy with Alberta's relationship with Ottawa, or who don't think Alberta is getting a fair shake or a fair deal, but they don't want to separate from Canada. They want to be Canadians. And I think that's with the, trying to balance with her negotiations with Mark Carney and getting these concessions. And I think it's quite surprising. I mean, we should note how, I think this just goes to show how versatile and durable the Liberal Party brand is in Canada. Is Mark Carney was basically able to flip everything on a dime in terms of the relationship between the federal government in Ottawa and the Conservative government in Edmonton on energy and environmental policy. And he's basically acquiesced to the nine in some form. Sometimes some laws have been rescinded, some have been amended, some have been rolled back.
Rendered meaningless, like the tanker ban.
Like the list of 9 policy changes that Danielle Smith demanded on the day after the Liberals won re-election last April. He's basically met all of them, and now they have a MOU and repeated press conferences announcing that they're recommitted towards this pipeline to the West Coast. We'll see what exactly happens with that. That's a big political deal, and you'll hear a lot about that in British Columbia, the province where the pipeline will have to go through. Obviously they have something to say about it and have some opinion on it, and even there it's divided. But there's very strong opinions, and I say stronger opinions on the other side than there are here in Alberta. But it's interesting to see how quickly Carney has moved to take that kind of. I don't want to say appeasement, because I don't think appeasement is the right move, but kind of responding to Danielle Smith's demands by say, meeting her demands, how quickly that is. And it's going to be interesting to see how and if, because I think this does happen with Danielle Smith, how and if the goalposts move going forward over the next 4 months.
Yeah, because she needs there to be escalation with the federal government. She needs that outside threat that she alone can protect Albertans from. So I can't see this. Things are getting better, and I think we should stick with it lasting.
Well, they no longer have Justin Trudeau, and they no longer have Stephen Guilbeault. So
right, exactly. And I mean, they could try Avi Lewis, but again, I mean, as it stands, and Smith boasted about this, right, in her address, right? The Greens, the NDP and Bloc represent, I think, 15% of Canadian voters, if that, right? And so it's this small group of extremists. Both major parties agree on the same thing. I do think Lewis will grow the NDP support, especially as Carney continues on the path he's on. And it looks like Quebec might be having its own referendum, depending on the results of its provincial election. But one thing there is, the Globe reported a month ago, maybe, that there's differences between Alberta and the feds on the route of the West Coast pipeline, right? Like the Smith wants to do Northern Gateway again, essentially, right? And that's going to run into the same problems Northern Gateway did in terms of, First Nations, approval, environmentalist concerns. I mean, again, on paper, there's still a tanker ban. Um, and, um, what Carney wants to do is essentially like twin TMX, right? Because that is already built in the route there,
Mhm.
right? It like makes it easier. And I wonder, if that becomes a source of friction, as we get closer to, again, October's when he's designating the project, as, national interest project. I mean, that's unclear to me whether he has to have a route in mind by then or what. I mean, I know again, Smith is going to bring forward the application, I think, in the next month or two, because no one in the private sector is interested at this point. And yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. But I suspect that would occur after the referendum, anyways, right?
I mean, I would suspect so. I can't imagine I mean, even talking about just like a private investors, I can't imagine, there would be private investors who would be eager to make big announcements about billion-dollar investments before this referendum question is settled in October. I mean, even though, as we talked about before, this is a referendum to hold a referendum in the future, but it's almost a referendum to decide whether or not it's going to be we're going to have a more destabilized and chaotic political and economic environment over the next coming years or not. But we're probably going to have a chaotic political and economic environment anyway, regardless of how this question resolves itself. It just makes it, whether it's going to decide whether the provincial government is going to be, an active player in engaging the rest of the country on whatever these constitutional negotiations they have in mind looks like. And to tell you the truth, I mean, truthfully, from what I've talked about and we're getting I'm just steering a little bit away from the pipeline discussion for just a second, but I've talked to academics at the University of Alberta and other places who've admitted that there's no real uh, negotiation set in stone negotiation process about what that looks like for a province to leave Canada, right? There would, most of the folks I spoke with said there would likely need to be amendments made to the Constitution. And, anybody who's studied the Charlottetown Accords or Meech Lake will understand that, that's a very high bar to meet and a very challenging political path to take because you need agreement from most, if not all, of the other provinces, plus the federal government, or super majorities in each legislature, or unanimity in each legislature, depending on what path you're taking. So it's unclear how that would actually exactly work. Um, and I've forgotten exactly where I was going with that thought. But just in terms of, I don't think this is going to end the discussion. The referendum in October isn't, I don't think it's going to settle things. I think that, you're going to have a political base in the United Conservative Party that I don't think is going to want to leave the UCP. I mean, I know there's been calls by folks like Jason Kenney that these separatist activists should go and start their own political party and run as a separatist political party in the next election if they want to promote Alberta separatism. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think that they already control a lot of the levers of power and a lot of the kind of organizational mechanisms of the United Conservative Party, and they have no reason to leave because it is their party. And so I think if you're, I mean, I've never been an oil executive sitting in a C-suite office in a big glass and steel tower in downtown Calgary or downtown Toronto or Houston. Um, but if I'm someone like that and I'm looking at shareholder interests or looking down, the path 5, 10 years down the road, that kind of instability probably doesn't fill me with confidence, regardless of what Brian Jean and what Danielle Smith say about Alberta's energy sector. We all know there's a lot of oil in northern Alberta. We all know that a pipeline could, in theory, pump out a lot more oil. We know that the international price of oil is all over the place right now and could be all over the place for quite some time because of Donald Trump's adventures in the Middle East. And but we don't really know what this looks like or whether a pipeline will actually begin construction as early as October 2027, which is what Danielle Smith and Prime Minister Mark Carney announced a couple weeks ago, and which would be conveniently right before, right at the start of the next provincial election in Alberta.
Yeah, it's interesting because I noticed this recently that, obviously the Chamber of Commerce crowd, right? Deb Yedlin in
Mhm.
Calgary, have come out, strongly saying this is bad for our members. This is bad for, investor confidence, yada, yada, yada. Big Oil, though, has not said a thing,
Mhm.
which I find very interesting because, and, I mean, they haven't come out in favor of independence, certainly, but because this is really all for them.
Mhm.
Right? Like, that's what it boils down to materially. Like, yes, there are all these cultural grievances sort of layered on top of it. But at the end of the day, and I think Tyler Dawson does a pretty good job, outlining the economic roots of Alberta separatism. It's about this desire to be free to pump as much oil as you want. And I can't help but wonder if what we're seeing or what we're not seeing is a result of like a calculated ambiguity on the part of you know oil executives who are you know waiting to see how it flushes out, or am I just overthinking it and Chamber of Commerce, I mean, speaks on their behalf?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's sometimes unclear who the Chamber of Commerce is speaking on behalf of and who they're not speaking on behalf of, because I mean, there's no, you know, as a friend of mine who's very engaged in politics in Edmonton likes to say, there is no business community in Edmonton. It's a pretty diverse group of people with all different diverse groups of interest. And obviously, I can't speak to Calgary, and I think the Calgary Chamber of Commerce, from my impression from Edmonton, is a little bit more of a prestigious group, has a little bit more, has a little bit more status and influence in Calgary than the Edmonton Chamber might like to have in Edmonton. But I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if the large oil executives from the large companies who have interests in Alberta and elsewhere are keeping their heads low on this, and because they don't necessarily want to get engaged in this type of discussion, and they don't necessarily want to become a target either. And that's the other thing, is it's such a volatile issue and such a volatile political situation. Is they don't if you don't want to become a target, you might want to keep your head down as long as you can. And they've also been involved. Some of the big oil companies have also been involved in the Oil Sands Alliance, which used to be called the Pathways Alliance, which is
Mm.
involved with this big carbon capture pipeline in Northeast Alberta, which is part of the MOU, which has faced a considerable amount of opposition from First Nations and agriculture and farm groups up in the Northeast. Um, so, they are involved in this through that group, but they've kind of let that group speak for them on that issue, which is kind of interesting. So I don't know how much there is to read in it. They're probably trying to get a view of the landscape, and don't really want to rock the boat too much with the provincial government either. Otherwise, because they'll see what kind of situation Danielle Smith has got herself into, what precarious situation she's in. Um, but they might not want to rock the boat on it.
Right. But yeah, I think that's probably the case. But you have to wonder if CNRL came out like a year ago and we're like, yeah, we're against this. We want to work, within the structures of Canadian federalism to get our product to market. You'd think it would have somewhat of a dampening effect on the spread of separatism, though, mind you, I think as a populist movement, the separatists would be
Mhm.
like, see, these elites who are out of touch with the oil and gas workers don't realize that, we would be doubling production if we, you know, uh, increased our dependency on the United States, which is essentially what the
Yeah, and
separatists want, to be charitable.
And we saw when Nancy Southern from ATCO came out and spoke about this last year. I mean, we saw that the same kind of, I mean, I'm sure that it had an influence on certain groups and had an influence on conservative moderates and folks in business circles. But we saw a lot of from separatist groups who, as you said, there's a very populist flavor of group, or flavor of movement. we saw a lot of derision about it, about the same thing you said. These are wealthy elites who are out of touch, who don't necessarily know what the average Joe Roughneck is doing, or what
Bernard.
Bernard. Oh yeah,
Whatever
Bernard
happened to
Roughneck.
him? Is he still around?
I have no idea. I have no idea.
I should get him on the podcast.
You should. That'd be actually kind of interesting to hear what he has to say about all this. For those of you who don't follow what we're talking about, Google the Roughneck circa 2015 to 2019. He was a bit of a political caricature in Alberta politics.
Yeah, him and Coup d'etat George, who I know is still around because he's in my mentions on Twitter
Oh yeah,
periodically, insulting me. But yeah, it is. It really does feel like we're on the precipice of something really dark, and for people like us, I mean, if you're a separatist, it's like the millennium. We're closer than we've ever been to a referendum on Alberta independence. We're closer than we've ever been to Alberta independence. And it's too close to comfort for people like us, not close enough for guys like Mitch Sylvester and David Parker. But things look bleak. But maybe we should talk about the other referendum questions, because
before you
ahead.
jump into that, Jeremy, I just want to say that it does feel bleak, and I think a lot of people are distressed or confused as to why we're even having this type of referendum on Alberta. It's a separation referendum, even though it's a referendum to not have another referendum, or maybe have another referendum in the future. I think it's really important for people who are pro Canada to come up with, to not just get stalled and stuck on the negatives, and get stalled and stuck on the kind of the fantastical utopian proposals and wild conspiracy theories that some of the you see on social media, that a lot of separatist groups are promoting, but to talk about and take advantage of this opportunity to talk about how why Alberta is better in Canada, why Canada is better with Alberta. And I think that's a big thing that we need to focus on over the next 4 months, is that what Canada is worth fighting for, and we need to lay out those reasons in a fact based, but also like in an emotional way. Let's not be afraid to get emotional about and passionate about why we believe Canada needs Alberta and Alberta needs Canada. And I think that's something that's really important. And also, don't be afraid to challenge the status quo either. And I think that's a big part of it. Is Canada is a great place to live. It's one of the best places to live in the world, but we can still do better on a lot of things. And not necessarily, not that we need to be acquiescing to some of the more extremist demands that some separatist groups make. I mean, some, not all, because it's a divisive issue even among separatists, but some who want to, who would rather us join the United States and become a state or a territory of the U.S. under Donald Trump. But talk about ways that we can improve Alberta and improve Canada. I think there's a real positive opportunity, and I think that a lot of that space looks like it's going to be filled by conservatives. And you see that with some of the groups that have just launched. I mean, one of the groups that Jen Gerson is involved in, the Lead Not Leave group, that's made up of a number of conservative type leaning academics and conservative political strategists and former conservative finance ministers. I mean, they're going to be coming up and proposing stuff. And I think it's really important that progressives also come up with ideas, because Canada can be improved. There's a lot of things we can do to improve Alberta, and a lot of things that Alberta can propose to make Canada a better place. And we don't have to talk about separatism, but we can talk about improving Canada at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's important too, that you don't want to get stuck in this negativity that we're just against separatism. Like, no, what is it that we're for? And what are ways in which, like, I mean, you do have to accept, I think, some of, right? Like, people are suffering. I mean, people are dying in emergency rooms. Classrooms are overcrowded. People can't afford rent, especially in Calgary. right,
Yeah.
and the separatists, I think, are have been very adept, or at least certainly Danielle Smith, who I don't think is a separatist,
Mhm.
but is very adept at emotionally connecting with people in making them feel like she's listening and that she cares about them,
Yeah.
which is why I think she's such an asset to the separatists, and they would be very short-sighted to remove her from power. But hey, if they want to do that,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. And 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 also
maybe
and also she's done a great job presenting the. I mean, I wrote about this I wrote a little bit about this today or yesterday, but I wrote a little bit more about this a few months ago about how Danielle Smith has really been successful in honing in and positioning herself as she's the change candidate, and she's
she's always
presented
a
the
change candidate.
she's always the change candidate, and
Well,
the
actually, in
NDP.
2012, it was interesting because it was actually Redford who was like unchanged
Yeah.
candidate, and
Yes. Well,
Smith
they
was
flipped
like,
it,
"I'll."
right? It was like a
Yeah,
Carney
yeah,
thing, right? Like they flipped it. I mean,
yeah,
not to
yeah,
say
yeah.
Cal
And then
Redford
in
took Mark's arm.
2023, though, she was, "I'm the change candidate."
Yeah.
Why won't Notley speak about her record? What she's trying to hide, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's a danger for, I mean, the pro-Canadian voices, but also the NDP, and then going up into the next provincial election is to be cast as the status quo, because it's clear that, I mean, you want to protect public education, you want to protect public health care, you want to protect public services, but there's a clear understanding out there that a lot of these systems aren't performing how they should, and a lot of that is because of what the government has done and continues to do. But at the same time, the government has been able to make the UCP has been able to make themselves look like the change candidates versus the NDP as the status quo, which I think is a really interesting situation, really interesting kind of narrative in Alberta politics that's going on right now.
Right, and that's the element of populism, right? Like it's to use an old communist phrase, it's a permanent revolution. That the UCP and the MAGA movement and other right wing populists are
Hmm.
doing, where there are constantly elites that need to be put in their place.
Hmm.
It allows them to portray things that are just a deepening of this status quo for the last 40 years, as being subversive and standing up to entrenched power. And Smith, has always been very talented at doing that. And you read some of her old newspaper columns or listen to her radio show. Um, she's always been very adept at reframing what is essentially a project of like upholding tradition
Hmm.
as overturning the status quo. um and you haven't seen any of that from the Alberta NDP. I mean, when Notley in 2015, I mean, again, I wasn't living here at the time, but I was taking great interest in it in Toronto. Just reading the freakouts in the National Post about having an NDP government in Alberta. And Notley was shaking up the stats. I mean, how could she not, right?
Yeah.
In that 2015 election. And then I think the farm safety bill in the disaster that was self-inflicted in part on the NDP's part, made them play it very safe after
Hmm.
that. And Kenny coming back, of course, and uniting the PCs and Wild Rose made sort of the NDP being a one-term government sort of a fait accompli. And I mean, they could have gone a lot further on a lot of things, given the fact that they were only likely to be in power for one term. I mean, the campaigns Notley ran in 2019, 2023, and what Nenshi seems to be doing now is just the opposite of populism, right?
Hmm.
It's no. The establishment is good. We need to preserve these institutions. Well, these institutions suck. Right. And yeah, like Smith is making them worse, like something like the AER, which is just, you read David Yeager's report.
The Alberta Energy Regulator.
Yeah. The
Yeah.
Alberta Energy Regulator, which has always been stacked with industry representatives, except, near the end of the NDP's term, they appointed Ed Whittingham, who's a, renewable energy guy who's, quite, friendly with industry, I would say, not as a
Mhm.
criticism, as an observation. And, Kenny made sure it was in the UCP platform that he's going to fire the anti-Alberta environmentalist activist Ed Whittingham. But you see, right, like David Yeager, Smith's old Wild Rose bagman and former party of the
Party
president,
president. Yeah.
and big time kind of small time oil and gas guy. And, he writes a report on the AER. That's like, yeah, it needs to be more responsive to industry. Right. And now he's, on the board of the AER. And, on paper, the AER is a pretty strong regulatory mandate, but,
Hmm.
it's captured by industry. And what's the NDP doing about that? Right? What are they even proposing? Like, I can't tell you. There might be something, but it's not like, if I don't know it, then certainly your average Albertan doesn't know it. And that's just one example of many of these hollowed out institutions that um, the NDP is saying that we need to protect. And that I think the Remain movement runs the risk, just like the Remain movement in the UK did, of saying, no, things are fine. And we need to preserve what we have. Whereas the populist right is like, let's take a wrecking ball to it and rebuild it in ways that will make it worse.
Hmm.
And and that's my worry, that this anti-system sentiment, right? Like you talked about, like
Hmm.
status quo, like it's really the system they're talking about, that it's being ceded to the separatists and the UCP. Um, and yeah, I'm very concerned about that, because um, there's just this constant moving of the conversation rightwards,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
I mean,
And it's, I think it's also a tendency among progressives and liberals, which is where I would probably put most of the Alberta NDP, because they are a moderate liberalish political party.
yeah,
Um, I think there's a tendency to defend the institution over the outcome. And I think that, when, obviously the institutions are important, then, and a lot of institutions are worth preserving, but they're also not perfect. And when it comes down to it, there's a lot of people who will, who care about the outcome because that's what they see. And it's making sure that those institutions are kept healthy and can respond to the needs of people, and are reformed, and work in a way that responds to people, so that that there's public support for them, is really important. And I think that's a role where progressive parties like the NDP, really have a role to play, and proposing those types of, not just bandaging a system that might not be working, but proposing solutions that fit within their ideological world, and that will
yeah.
deliver positive outcomes for normal people. I think that's key. That's key to it. But now we're talking about the next provincial election and platforms and stuff, but
Right, which seems like
which is
a
only like
lifetime
16 months
away.
away. That's the other thing is, this referendum, these referendums are coming in 4 months, and then we have, a provincial election almost, maybe 16 months away, maybe sooner than that. Who knows what's going to happen depending on the
Well,
outcome.
there was a piece you wrote after the 2012 election that I found while I was doing
Oh,
research for the
okay.
book, and I quote it, um, because you talk about, I think this is when, like, the legislature's back after the election, and you talk about this, like, permanent negative campaign that the Wild Rose
Mhm.
are running. And I can't help but be reminded of that when we're talking about how we're going into this referendum campaign, and then a year later is the election. Plus, we've got the electoral boundaries stuff that is a whole other conversation
Mhm.
that um and yeah, when does it end?
It doesn't. You just keep on going. They just keep on
Right.
going. And I don't recall the exact article, but I vaguely remember what you're talking about. Jeremy. I mean, the Wild Rose Party, when Danielle Smith became leader of the Wild Rose Party in the late 2000s, and then led the party to become official
2009.
opposition,
Yeah.
2009, yeah, and then led the party to become official opposition in 2012. It really was a very different style of official opposition party than we've seen in a long time in Alberta politics, as far back as I can remember. I mean, when in the 90s and in the 2000s, when the Liberal Party formed the official opposition, and I worked for the Liberals for a bit in the mid 2000s, early and mid 2000s, when they'd formed the official opposition.
That
Um,
was
and
Taft era.
that was the Kevin Taft era, and it was a very different type of political party and political camp and caucus than what the Wild Rose brought to the official opposition. It was a lot more mild mannered, a lot more policy focused. Uh, Probably not as, I mean, definitely not as politically cutting as and in your face as the Wild Rose Party. But when the Wild Rose came to official opposition, I mean, they brought in, you could see there were a lot of people from a lot of political staffers and campaigners from Ottawa and other parts of the province who'd worked for, the federal Conservatives in Ottawa, who were, much more aggressive than kind of than nice, polite mannered Conservatives of the past. Um, because it worked, and it worked for them in terms of forming government, in terms of cutting the Liberals down federally. And we saw that in Alberta in 2012, the Wild Rose brought that same type of politics to Alberta in a way that we hadn't really had before, and it was conservative on conservative, which is something we hadn't really seen in Alberta politics for a little while. And while the NDP were kind of a much smaller opposition, and they punched a lot higher, a lot higher above their weight. I guess that's kind of an awkward way of saying it. They punched above their weight in terms of being a tiny opposition party of 2 or 4 MLAs, and they were a lot punchier, and their styles were, pardon me, somewhat similar to the Wild Rose Party. But the Wild Rose were really aggressive, and it was really a nonstop campaign against against Ed Stelmach before, and then Alison Redford, and then well, not Jim Prentice, because they ended up all joining Jim Prentice as PCs. But there was a period there where it was a very different style of politics, and then you saw it again, even though Danielle Smith and most of the Wild Rose MLAs crossed the floor in 2015 when the NDP government was formed. So it was a big surprise to most people, including the NDP. The Wild Rose under Brian Jean and then later Jason Kenney with the UCP used a lot of those same tactics, and it really was a permanent campaign. And you did see a lot of conservative campaigners from across the country come to Alberta, and you also saw on the NDP side a lot of New Democrats campaigners and organizers and staffers from across the country come to Alberta, and it was a really
Run
different.
top. Nate
Yeah,
Republican.
and I mean, across the board, from every minister's office, there was someone who had been a chief of staff in Manitoba or British Columbia or Nova Scotia or somewhere where there'd been an NDP government, Saskatchewan, for example. Um, and it did bring a real different flavor to Alberta politics, and it brought a lot of people in who didn't necessarily understand Alberta politics, or understand, I'd say on both sides, understand the history of Alberta politics, and it really changed things. I'd say in not for the better. I think it was a real awkward time, but we now, it was the first time that we'd had competitive electoral politics in Alberta between two political parties, and that it hadn't been a one party dominant place in a long time.
Yeah, and I think, it was interesting because I sort of had to really, when I was writing the book, brush up on the Wild Rose years,
Hmm.
which I only knew, sort of Cole's Notes versions, and seeing Shane Saskew talk about how calling Alison Redford's sister, who is an AHS executive, a
Hmm.
criminal in the Legislative Assembly, I think
Wow.
is
Yeah.
a good example of that. And then of course Rob Anderson talking about reporting Redford to the Law Society because of the tobacco litigation contract she awarded to her ex-husband, with whom she was quite close, still
Yeah.
law firm. It was really nasty, very personal.
Hmm.
And it would be nice to see maybe the NDP I mean adopt some of those tactics, because we are I think our opponents are they're freaks.
Well,
They're ghouls. We probably disagree
I
on
think
that
there's
one,
just
but
there's like a no holds barred to element to politics that wasn't necessarily there before. At least wasn't under the progressive conservatives. And I think that there's a lot of I think the thing about a lot of conservative politics, especially in Alberta right now, is that, and not this isn't everybody in conservative politics, because I know that the UCP, it's not as big a tent as the progressive conservatives used to be, but it still is a bigger, it is still is a somewhat, it is a tent. So there
yeah,
are
you got
conservatives.
separatists, anti-vaxxers,
Well,
religious, corporate types. I think
yeah.
that's the big coalition. It's really like corporate Calgary in like rural reactionaries.
Well, and movement conservatives too, I think is something that's a group that's really important to recognize. But I think that going back to and I see that in the chat, Lee Richardson, who's a former member of Parliament from Calgary, who was I think he was
Oh,
a PC MP and then later on a Conservative MP in the 2000s. Posted in the chat, Reform Party grievance populism is what Lee said, and I think that that's another important element to talk about with with the split between the Wild Rose and the Progressive Conservatives going back into the early 2010s, is there really was, it was carried on a carry on of this division between conservatives at the federal level, which
hmm,
at the provincial level had been kind of preserved under one big tent under Ralph Klein's leadership and that kind of populism. And I mean, Ralph Klein and Preston Manning did not always get along. I mean, I remember reading articles from the 1990s where there were times where Preston Manning had threatened to start a provincial reform party to challenge Ralph Klein. And even going back to the 1993 election, when the Liberals under Lawrence DeCore were running a very much a more right-wing Liberal campaign, there were federal reformers who were running as provincial Liberal candidates. So there was like a liberal reform coalition on the provincial level, and that had to do about change because they wanted to kick the PCs out, because they wanted to kick the PCs out federally and the PCs out provincially. And Klein was able to kind of hold that coalition together and then broaden it after DeCore left as liberal leader. But you really saw going into the 2010s that split between the Wild Rose and the PCs. I mean, some of it did follow along Wild Rose, or pardon me, along Reform PC lines, and you had folks like Tom Flanagan, for example, being very involved in the campaign, Danielle Smith's campaign in 2012. You had a lot of prominent reformers who were involved. You had
yeah.
folks like Jason Kenney, who was a Reform Party MP back in the 90s, who was
Yeah.
involved supporting folks like Rob Anders, pardon me, who was involved supporting the Wild Rose and a whole
Who
host
goes
of
way
others.
back with Smith to University of Calgary.
Yeah, yeah. So
And yeah,
that's
Cliff Friars
yeah.
was also in, and actually Flanagan sort of replaced I believe Rick Anderson is his name, as the campaign manager at the last minute. um and yeah, and there was an interesting piece I found, an old piece from Kevin Lieben in the National
Oh
Post
yeah.
from the I think it was probably around the time Smith won the leadership, where source from the federal conservatives was like, these divisions that we thought we had overcome on a federal level are gonna reemerge. And because it was also Mark Durholm, the person
Oh
that
yeah.
Smith trounced for the Wilders leadership. I mean, he had Craig Chandler working for him,
Yeah.
and I think some people from like Raheem Jaffer's office and Jason Kenney's office. And so even within the Wild Rose, there was sort of
Mhm.
those tensions. But yeah, I mean, it's the this sort of um you know Western grievance politics is I mean, something that's been around for a very long time. Like, I mean, really going back to the foundation of Alberta and Saskatchewan, and them not having control over their natural resources until 1930, when the federal government decided to ignore the treaties with First Nations, which we have a pattern there, and give jurisdiction over natural resources to the Western provinces without any consultation. And so, there is this inherent tension, I think, between Aboriginal rights, as it's called in the legislation,
Mhm.
and this Western Canadian grievance politics that is at its core about resource extraction, although there are other grievances layered on top, like multiculturalism and bilingualism, and and of course First Nations actually having rights outside of like individual rights that
Mhm.
everyone has equally, right?
Mhm.
And and I think you're seeing all those things surface in the lead up to the referendum. um and I think this might be a good way to segue into I know we don't have that much time left because I do have to run around 4:30ish, but
Sure.
um um right, so we've got 9 questions plus the bonus uh referendumception question. um and so we've got 5 on immigration.
Yeah.
That was interesting too, because if you look at like the Free Alberta strategy, where the playbook that Smith seems to be following pretty
Mhm.
loosely, that of course her chief of staff Rob Anderson helped write with Barry Cooper, who's a total separatist now, and a sort of anti-lockdown lawyer named Derek Fromm, Airdrie. And so the Alberta Sovereignty Act's from there, the pension plan, the police, there's an Alberta Banking Act thing that's very social credit coded that she hasn't done. Where, just setting up these provincial financial institutions that like withhold money from the feds.
That's
That
fascinating because
Yeah.
not to
Cooper
jump too
said
much, not to jump
I
too much into my favorite era of Alberta politics, which is the 1930s, which was just
oh,
an
same.
absolute fascinating and wild time in Alberta.
I finally read
But
CB McPherson's Democracy in Alberta book on
oh
social
yeah,
credit.
that's a
Yeah,
great
yeah,
book. It's a
yeah.
real seminary. Yeah, it's a great book. It's a
Yeah,
real
yeah,
seminary. I always said seminary. I meant
yeah.
seminal piece of literature
Seminary. Yeah.
on. It's a real yes. Well, I mean, if you were listening, if you were listening to Bill Aberhart, it would be a seminary.
Yeah.
But it's a real seminal piece. And actually, it's interesting. I was talking with Carissa Halson, Edmonton author, who just wrote a book called Revolution Songs. That was it's a fiction book about the Crow's Nest Pass in the 1920s and 1930s, and
Oh, okay, I heard of those.
revolutionary, and about the women who were involved in kind of the real left revolutionary movements in the Crow's Nest Pass in the 1930s and 20s. And I definitely recommend you guys picking it up. It's a great book. But we were talking about how in the 1930s, it was, one of the big elements of, right now we talk about affordability here. Lots of talks about affordability, lots of talks about, interest rates and the cost of groceries dealing. But in the 1930s, one of the big things that social creditors really talked about, and a lot of people who were talking about institutional reform around affordability were talking about, was banking reform. And we don't really hear a lot about banking reform these days. So that's interesting. Now, it's been a while since I've looked at the Rob Anderson's Free Alberta strategy, but I'll have to look that up to see if they want to start printing their own money or something.
Yeah. And that was in Barry Cooper told me, I interviewed him for the book, and he had some very colorful quotes that I have towards the end of the book that I don't think I'm gonna tell people what they are.
Buy the
But
book.
yeah, you gotta buy the book. It's out in October. But if you go to Dundurn Press's website and look up Dark Phoenix by Jeremy Appel, you can put in your email and they'll tell you when you can pre-order it, which should be relatively soon. But yeah, Cooper was like, that was all Anderson's idea, and he thought it was like a really inventive way to actually and he didn't draw the parallel with social credit, but it's very clear, like, get these Eastern bankers' hands off of our money. And there's also, I mean, crypto is also, I think, very social credit coded, which Danielle Smith, if you look at her disclosure form from the past year, owns more than $10,000 in Bitcoin. And, you know, she spoke at like a Bitcoin conference when she was like, I think around the time she announced she was running for the UCP leadership.
Yeah.
You know, she's talked about doing blockchain voting, which experts say is not a good idea. She you know, the whole crypto sphere and how the sort of far right has, I mean, that's kind of more of a, I feel like a COVID thing, 2022 now. You don't hear them talk about it as much, which is
Yeah.
interesting, but it is very much, it did remind me of social credit in this idea that the modern banking system is corrupted, and you know, it just serves these elite interests. So we're going to take financial power back with, you know, fake money. And you know, there's what you read one of her newsletters, right? She had the newsletter
Yeah.
after she quit the Herald, and I got some PDFs. A friend of mine saved them of some of the later ones around the time she announced she was running, but she'd been doing the newsletter for a while, and I think Justin Ling's done some reporting on some of the,
Oh,
you
yeah,
know,
the locals.com, and yeah, I think I have all those.
yeah. Well, the
letters
locals, I
as
signed
well.
up. I had a locals account. I watched all the AMAs.
Yeah.
But the newsletter was separate. That
Yeah.
was just like an email newsletter.
She spent a lot of time
And
talking about her vacation home in Panama. That was the
yes, which she didn't have at the time, which is
no, but
interesting.
anyway. Not, I thought it was interesting because she spent a lot of time talking about it in a newsletter, and it seemed very clear that she. I mean, who wouldn't want to spend a lot of time in Panama? That she wanted to spend more time there, and then she jumps back into politics. And I thought, well, okay, well that's interesting because it sounded like you wanted to spend a lot of more time in Panama, which is a totally sensible thing to do.
Well,
Or was it
David
Costa
bought.
Rica or something? I
No,
forget.
it's Panama. It's Panama. I got the registry documents. It's in the
Oh,
book,
okay.
but uh, it's in David's name, David Moretta, her husband, and
Okay.
he bought it in 2023. So a year, yeah, 2023 or 2024.
Okay.
It's in the book. So read it in 5 months when it's out. But yeah, interesting. It was quite expensive, and not sure how the owner of the you know, dining railcar restaurant in High River would have you know, almost $500,000 kicking around, but yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, just asking questions, you know. But where's oh yeah, but in this newsletter, she also, there's one really good one where she's, I think, hyping this Bitcoin conference that she's like, I think she was emceeing it or something, and she's talking about how like cryptocurrency, this is our path to Alberta independence, because then we have currency that isn't being controlled by the Canadian Mint, and their and which might create a global digital currency, right? Might be involved in that. We can actually like hold our own money through crypto. And probably the craziest ever newsletters I read,
Wow.
for sure. And yeah, that was she should bring it back. She should run for mayor of High River and just write newsletters and like do her like weird like state capacity libertarian like tech bro experiments on High River, and just, you know, leave the rest of us out of it. But yeah, okay, so there are 9 referendum questions. The Free Alberta strategy doesn't talk about immigration at all, right? And in fact, as many have pointed out, as recently as 2 years ago, Smith was agitating against the federal government for not allocating enough immigrants to Alberta, right? In fact, she called on them to double it. But it's really, I think, the separatist movement, the anti-immigrant stuff is really coming from them, right? Mitch Sylvester is, I mean, like a white replacement theory guy. Smith was hanging out with Tucker in early 2024, also a white replacement theory guy. Not that she espouses white replacement theory, but this idea that like there are just too many immigrants coming, right? And it's actually constraining our the state's capacity to like provide for citizens. I mean, you saw, the Alberta Next Roadshow. I mean, particularly in Lloydminster. I mean, I went to the
Yeah.
one in Red Deer, and there's definitely it was like classic anti-immigrant, like, my wife is having her social assistance cut, yet these immigrants are just coming and just getting all these benefits that they don't actually get. Right. And Smith obviously is very good at being like, yeah, I understand your concerns. I feel your pain. But in Lloydminster, people were like talking about like, when are you going to start the deportations?
Wow.
And another person asked, can you ask President Trump to provide asylum for, God-fearing Christian Canadians like us who just, don't feel at home here anymore. And so that, she's really dialed that. And of course, Brexit, of course, was also very much framed around these like cultural concerns
Mhm.
regarding immigration, rooted in myths and disinformation. We've got 5 questions on immigration. The first one, I mean, is such a loaded question, right? Asking, should the government of Alberta assume control over immigration to bring it back to sustainable levels? Which, I mean, also, first of all, I mean, Carney has greatly constrained immigration. In fact, Trudeau greatly constrained immigration
Yeah.
in his sort of later months, right? So even if we think that the cost of living is because of immigrants, which I don't think we should, because I think it lets certain interests off very easy that are making a lot of money off of people struggling. Um, um, again, we're being asked to solve a problem that isn't a problem. Even if you accept a certain explanation of why things are the way they are, there's cutting off uh, access to social services for essentially temporary residents, people who aren't PRs, citizens, or Alberta approved immigrants, which is, once we assume control over immigration, then, and it's interesting there. It's sort of like, and then the next one is, okay, um, if you do think that, temporary residents should have access to social services, um, can we cut them off until they've been here a year? Right. And then, should, you have to provide proof of citizenship to vote, right? Which I think dovetails into sort of the conspiracy crowd's, concerns about mass voter fraud and vote tabulators, and all that. And then there are 4 more questions about constitutional things that just are giving Smith things to complain about. So you've got, and a lot of these are like, sort of, again, Reform Party style, Western grievance politics. Should provinces be able to take money for social programs and not spend it on social programs? When provincial and federal laws contradict, should provincial laws supersede them? Which is kind of not how living in a country works, but okay. There's what's the other one?
You're talking about the courts? The
Oh yes, of course, the
Yeah.
courts. Should we appoint our own judges? Should provinces have the power to appoint federal judges? Right now, the federal government appoints them based on recommendations from the
Mhm.
provincial governments. And then my favorite, and one I'm actually probably going to vote for, should we abolish the Senate? Which is an interesting twist on a classic Reform Party Canadian Alliance
Well, it says,
policy,
should we
right?
abolish the unelected federal Senate? So I think it's leaving.
Oh, the way they word these, so good.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, because I mean, the federal NDP's position for a long time has been to just abolish the Senate,
Yeah.
whereas the Conservatives and the Reform Party and the alliance before them was like, no, let's make it American style,
I think,
essentially.
and I mean, I don't want to focus too much on the Senate one. I mean, I'm an electoral reform nerd, so I could talk a long time about what I think about the Senate and about different electoral systems. But I mean, I do think that there's not to criticize the people that are in the Senate, because I do think there are people who have been appointed to the Senate who are doing meaningful work in the roles that they play in the Senate. But I don't think there's a role for an unelected House of Parliament in 2026. I don't think there was a role for an unelected House of Parliament in 1990. If we were to
Yeah.
be creating this today, you know, if first, let's just say we were creating a new country tomorrow. We probably wouldn't create, or wouldn't be, acceptable to most people if we created one House of Parliament that was elected and one that was appointed. It's just not something we would do in 2026. And I understand the arguments around stability and consistency and bringing more people into politics who might not run for elected office, but I think. I think we should have an elected. I think we should have a Senate, and we should have an elected Senate. And I think Alberta's provincial Senate elections are not meaningful, and people don't really take them seriously because the government doesn't really take them seriously. But I do think that there is a role for that. So I honestly haven't decided how I'm going to vote on any. I mean, I know how I'm going to vote on some of these questions. But there are a few like that one that I haven't quite decided how I'm going to vote. How I'm going to vote on. But I think touching on the non-constitutional immigration questions that you raised, really, which I think are the most contentious ones and the most dangerous ones, um, and really where I think that the provincial government is playing with fire, that they think they can control, but they don't really control. I mean, these four questions, there's been, you see polling and you see public opinion pieces. There's certainly been a shift in public attitudes around immigration levels in this country. Um, I think that some of that comes from the United States and influence from mega Republicans and what's happening in the United States. I think you probably find, and I mean, I'd have to look at polling, but I think you'd probably find that there are groups of Canadians who are who have shifted their opinions more towards anti-immigration opinions, and some Canadians who have fortified their opinions towards pro-immigration and pro-protection of immigrants and services to immigrants in response to what they're seeing happening in the United States. And I think especially among separatist groups in Alberta, which we know are very, it's a populist group. It's among at least among their leadership, it's a very online group. It's a very group that is very influenced by the kind of mega expanded universe and the mega media ecosystem online. And, almost immediately when you saw in 2024 Donald Trump really ratcheting up the anti-immigration rhetoric, you saw the same type of thing, weeks and a few months later start popping up on separatist Facebook groups and through separatist chats and more conservative UCP chat groups. So, as there's been shifts around these attitudes, I think that Danielle Smith and the UCP, I mean, they took advantage of that to blame immigration levels and blame immigrants for the pressures and the challenges that we're seeing on our healthcare and our education systems here in the province of Alberta. And our population has increased significantly in Alberta. I think it's gone up like 20% in the last 6 years or something. Like we've had a huge population boom. But as you said, Jeremy, I mean, part of that is, not only was Danielle Smith asking Justin Trudeau and Mark Carney to increase immigration levels in Alberta, but the provincial government for the previous 2 years ran the
Alberta is calling.
Alberta is calling. Yes. Yes. Ring, ring. Alberta is calling. and encouraging people from across the country. And they had programs targeting specific workers outside of Canada to come and work in Alberta. At the point where we really did, in some sectors, really did have a shortage. And then lo and behold, a lot of people from Toronto, a lot of people from Vancouver, where it's impossible to buy a house unless you have super generational wealth, they moved to Edmonton, they moved to Calgary, they moved to places in Alberta because you can still afford a house here. And the population increased significantly. Um, and it's also a good place to live on top of that. And now, you saw government take advantage of the shifting politics on immigration to basically blame new Canadians for the pressures on healthcare and education when, in Alberta, we haven't dealt with pressures on education or healthcare in decades. I mean, I think what's the stat is the last new hospital that wasn't a replacement hospital was built in Calgary, opened in Calgary in like 2012, and the last new hospital that was built in Edmonton was built in 1988. So, and these are cities that have grown substantially. Edmonton is now has been more than a million people for a number of years. And we have the same number of hospitals in Edmonton as we did in the late 1980s. So no wonder, emergency rooms are overflowing. No wonder the healthcare system is feeling tons of pressure because we have about, 2.5 million new people here than we did 40 years ago. So I think these are really irresponsible and dangerous questions. I've seen some UCP cabinet ministers say, "Well, we're just asking," but
Because they're just asking questions. That's
they're
what
just
Danielle's
asking
been
questions, and
doing
yeah, they are
her
asking
entire
questions,
career.
but these are meaningful questions that have that presumably a government presumably they're seeking action to or permission to act upon, going into the next few years. And yes, I want if my neighbor is a new Canadian and an immigrant or a refugee, I want their kids to be able to go to school and have a good public education here. I want them to be able to have access to healthcare if their kids get sick or if they have their grandparents with them for them to get sick. I don't want, I want the best for them in hopes that one day they'll become Canadian citizens. And even if they're not Canadian citizens, they're my neighbors and they're contributing to the community and to making Alberta a better place. And I don't think that we should even flaunt around the idea of taking away those types of access to services, which in some cases are already severely limited. And that's the other thing. In some cases, people don't have access to some of this stuff anyway. So
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think that those are actually, the most dangerous questions. I mean, regardless of what happens with the referendum within a referendum, I mean, the separatist issue isn't going away. It's still going to be, make its way through the courts. It's just there to, you know, I mean, in an effort to mollify the separatists obviously hasn't been working. But it's really the immigration stuff that's dangerous. And also dovetails with what the separatists want. If you read The Value of Freedom, the
Mhm.
APP's costed platform, and the dollar numbers, I mean, you can just completely disregard those because it's
It's all made up.
it's all made up.
Well, I mean,
But
this is Alberta. There's always money in the banana stand, right? That's
yeah.
the
Yeah. Well, especially when we pull out of, every climate commitment that we haven't already pulled out of, and don't have the woke Laurentians telling us what to do. In terms of I mean, it envisions tens of thousands of deportations, both to the Alberta-less Canada and sending back people back to where they came from in a span of a few years, right? So this is again a way where Smith is like advocating for things that are separatist adjacent but
well,
not on
yeah.
the fundamental question, because I think that's the bigger danger than should Alberta initiate the legal process required under the Canadian Constitution to have an independence referendum, right?
Yeah, and I think that I mean the government of Alberta. I mean they do have asking for control over immigration, to have, preferred Alberta status for example, if you're seeking a certain type of person to come over and fill a certain job market that needs to be filled. That's not outrageous stuff. But I think that the problem is I don't think any of these questions are being approached in good faith. So there's lots of things that provinces can do. And, we talk about Quebec does a lot of things. They can have a lot more control over immigration. Alberta certainly could have a lot more control over immigration. Alberta could have a provincial police force. Alberta could have a provincial pension plan. But it's not necessarily in the best interest of Alberta. I think the issue is that we have a government that hasn't really proven that they're acting in good faith on any of these issues. So they didn't prove they were acting on good faith on separatism. We see they haven't been acting on good faith in healthcare or in education, or labor issues, or anything, a lot of stuff across the board. So the question is we have a government that's asking for permission to do something. I mean, some of the stuff that's outrageous, and I think that it's more outrageous in the context of what you just talked about, Jeremy, with the Alberta Prosperity Project and what they're proposing, the mass deportations that these prominent separatist groups are calling for and asking for. That you have a government that is politically connected to these groups. You have these groups that are, for the most part, the leadership, a lot of these groups are prominent UCP members. And the problem is that I see is that none of this is being approached in good faith. It's incredibly cynical. It's being approached through a political lens of, not necessarily. I'd say not doing what's best for Albertans, but doing what's best for Danielle Smith's leadership and for the United Conservative Party. And I think that's where this gets really dangerous. Is province? There's lots of, autonomous things. There are lots of things that provinces can do to take over programs that are run by the federal government now that potentially could be run by the provincial government. And some of that is good, and some of that is, you got to ask, well, why? It's not actually going to improve things for Albertans. It's more of a political gamesmanship fight. But I think these immigration questions are really tainted and coated in the kind of, I say coated, not coded, coated in the kind of mega politics that also surrounds a lot of these separatist discussions that we're having in Canadian politics and in Alberta politics. And I think that's why it's most dangerous.
Yeah, well put. And I think that's probably a good note to wrap up on. Thanks so much for joining me, Dave. This was Dave's first live stream.
My very first on Substack. Yeah.
I probably didn't notice until I said so, because he's doing great. I mean, you've been on radio, right? So,
I've done streaming before. I've just never done streaming on Substack before.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
No, I've done like Google.
You've done live hits
and and stuff, absolutely. But yeah, this is my first Substack one, so I'm glad it worked. I'm looking into my phone right now, and I got the two screens cut in half here up above.
Oh, you're doing it on your phone?
I am doing it on my phone, yeah.
Oh, because originally you could only do it on your phone. Now that you can do it on your computer, so I've been doing it on my computer,
good.
Just so I have my mic and my webcam. But you sound great
for next time. Thank you.
I'm sure we'll be doing this again at some point in the next in the coming months as things happen, as they tend to in Alberta, and we get closer to this referendum.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jeremy, for having me on. It's been a real treat to spend an hour and a half chatting Alberta politics with you. And I see there's 70 people who are watching right now who've joined us the whole way. So thank you so much to everyone who tuned in to watch us. Really, really appreciate it.
Yeah. And if you are new to Dave, his Substack is Dave Berda, where you will learn a lot about Alberta political history. So definitely check that out. I am Jeremy Appel at The Orchard, and have a good weekend, everyone. It's Friday. Sorry, my mouse is... I'm trying to hit the end button. My mouse had disappeared. All right. Bye.
Okay. Take care.